Garrett Holloway stood in front of his old garage with motor oil on his hands, the kind of stain that never fully washes out no matter how long you scrub. Behind him, under a gray canvas tarp, sat a 1967 Shelby GT500 that hadn't moved from that spot in years. Whitney Boone stepped out of a black Rolls-Royce, smoothed her blazer, and placed a check for $1 million on the hood like it was the most generous thing anyone had ever done for a man like him. She thought a single father drowning in back taxes would sign anything put in front of him. Garrett looked at the check, looked at the car, and said, "Not even for $1 million." Whitney laughed. 10 days later, that same car sold for $5 million. Stay until the very end, because the real reason Garrett turned down $1 million will leave that CEO completely speechless. The town of Denton, Arizona didn't have much to recommend it. 2 traffic lights, a diner that had been under the same management since the 1980s, and enough flat desert on the outskirts to make a man feel genuinely small if he stood still long enough. Garrett Holloway had grown up here, left briefly for trade school in Phoenix, and returned when his wife, Lena, got sick the first time. He stayed when she got sick the second time. He stayed after she was gone. That was 6 years ago. He wasn't leaving now. Holloway Auto Works occupied a corner lot on the far end of Maynard Street. One main bay, a second bay he used for storage, a hand-painted sign that had faded to near illegibility, and a rolling door that announced itself loudly every time it opened. He fixed trucks mostly. Old pickup trucks belonging to ranchers and retired veterans who needed another 40,000 miles out of something that should have been retired a decade ago. He was good at it. Efficient, honest, and cheap enough that people drove in from 2 towns over. On the morning that everything began to shift, Garrett was underneath a '93 F-150 when his daughter Tessa knocked on the side of the truck with her knuckle, the way she always did to let him know she was leaving. She was 14, organized in ways that made him feel slightly embarrassed about himself, and she had already made her own lunch and triple-checked her backpack before he'd even had coffee. "You haven't eaten," she said, not asking. He slid out from under the truck, found a thermos of coffee and half a granola bar waiting on the workbench, and they exchanged a look that communicated everything that mattered. She walked to the bus stop. He went back to work. This was the shape of their mornings. At the back of the garage, separated from the working bays by a wall of old shelving and a thick canvas tarp that Garrett had replaced twice in 10 years, sat the Shelby. Officially, it was a 1967 GT500 coupe. Unofficially, it was the one thing in Garrett's life that didn't have a price tag attached to it, even though half the town assumed the opposite. His father, Roy Holloway, had brought the car home in the late 1970s, already more than a decade old, and had never offered more explanation than was strictly necessary. Roy was a man who believed that certain things earned their own stories over time without any help from the person holding them. He worked on engines for a living, did some private performance testing for a brief period before Garrett was born, and kept the Shelby covered and clean in a way that had nothing to do with resale value. When Roy died 7 years ago, the car passed to Garrett with a metal lockbox and a single instruction: don't sell it to anyone who doesn't understand what it is. Every week without fail, Garrett pulled back the tarp, started the engine, let it run for 10 minutes, and listened. He would wipe down the chassis numbers stamped inside the door jamb. He would check the papers in the lockbox: photographs, a handwritten letter, a mileage sheet from what looked like an official testing record, a shipping invoice with a strange designation printed in faded ink. He didn't fully understand what all of it meant, but he kept it, and he kept it carefully. A neighbor named Dale Pruitt had asked him once, not unkindly, why he didn't just sell the thing and pay off the back taxes he owed on the property. Garrett had looked at the tarp for a moment before answering. "There are things you don't sell before you understand what they actually are," he said. Dale had nodded as though he understood, though Garrett suspected he didn't. Most people in Denton assumed the Shelby was a sentimental old heap with a dead battery and a good story. Most people in Denton were working with incomplete information. What none of them knew, what Garrett himself was only beginning to piece together, was that a few weeks earlier, a local teenager had been helping Garrett move a shelf near the back bay, had caught a glimpse of the Shelby's hood under the lifted tarp, and had filmed roughly 40 seconds of video on his phone. He posted it without thinking too much about it. The clip was grainy, the audio was rough, but when Garrett started the engine in the background to check the idle, 3 seconds of sound got captured that would eventually be heard by exactly the wrong person at exactly the right time. Whitney Boone did not browse the internet casually. She had people for that. Specifically, she had Nolan Pierce, her head of acquisitions at Boone Heritage Motors, whose entire professional function was to surface things worth her attention. Boone Heritage was headquartered in West Hollywood in a converted warehouse with exposed beams, designer lighting, and floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over a courtyard where they kept 3 showcase vehicles at any given time. The company specialized in rare automotive finds, sourcing, authenticating, restoring, and reselling collectible American cars to buyers with more money than patience. Whitney had built it from a regional brokerage into something that got profiled in trade magazines and invited to private collector events in Scottsdale and Pebble Beach. She was 4 years old, had no patience for inefficiency, and had an instinct for undervalued assets that she considered one of the few truly reliable things about herself. When Nolan sent her the 40-second clip, she watched it twice before calling him back. The first time she watched for the visual details, the vented hood, the placement of the GT500 badge slightly rearward of the standard position, the lower body seam that ran a 1/4 inch longer than production spec. The second time she closed her eyes and listened to the engine. The sound was layered in a way that off-the-lot GT500s weren't, a particular mid-range resonance that came from a different cam profile. She didn't say any of this to Nolan immediately. She said, "Find out who owns this." Nolan found out within 48 hours. The owner was a 38-year-old garage mechanic in Denton, Arizona, named Garrett Holloway. He owed $11,000 in back property taxes. He had a daughter in middle school. His garage had 3 active accounts and 3 inactive ones. His credit file was manageable but tight. The property itself had been in the family for 30 years. Whitney listened to Nolan read through the summary and felt something she privately recognized as anticipation, though she would have described it to anyone who asked as professional assessment. "He's cash-strapped," she said. "He doesn't know what he has." Nolan suggested approaching with an offer in the range of $300,000, which would be a windfall for a man in Garrett's position and a fraction of what the car might bring if her instincts were right. Whitney thought about that for about 3 seconds before deciding it was too modest for what she had in mind. She wanted to make an offer that didn't look like an offer at all. It had to look like rescue. $1 million, she decided, was the exact number that would make a man in financial difficulty feel like he'd won, while she was actually walking away with something worth 4 times that. She had already spoken to Preston Tate, a private collector in San Francisco who had spent 2 years looking for an authenticated GT500X prototype and who had the resources and the motivation to pay anything within reason. $1 million in person, she told Nolan. "We drive out there. We make it feel ceremonial. He won't say no." Nolan had agreed. He was wrong. They arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 vehicles total. Whitney's Rolls-Royce, a black SUV carrying Nolan and 2 junior staff members, and a flatbed transport that had been booked to take the car the same day. The convoy pulled into the lot at Holloway Auto Works and sat there for a moment in the way that expensive things often do before making their presence fully understood. The rolling door was open. Garrett was visible through it, wiping down a socket wrench with a red shop rag. He looked up when the cars pulled in, but he didn't walk toward them. He waited for them to come to him, which they did. Whitney stepped out first. She was dressed in a charcoal blazer and slim trousers, heels that made a specific kind of sound on asphalt, and she wore the particular expression of a person who has already decided how a conversation is going to end. She looked at the sign above the garage door. She looked at the stain on the concrete apron. She looked at the single oscillating fan mounted on the wall above the tool bench. None of it impressed her. She introduced herself, told Garrett who she was and what her company did, and asked directly whether he was the person who owned the 1967 Shelby. Garrett said yes. She asked to see it. He said nothing for a moment, then set down the wrench and walked to the back of the garage without further comment, which was either indifference or confidence, and Whitney, despite herself, couldn't immediately tell which. When he pulled the tarp back, the car came into view the way a well-kept secret does, all at once undeniable. The paint was aged, a dark navy that had gone slightly chalky in places, but the body was straight and the chrome was intact, and the leather inside was cracked but original. The hood was bolted clean. The engine bay, when Garrett lifted it, showed no modifications and no visible rust. When he started the car, the sound moved through the concrete floor of the garage and up through the soles of everyone's shoes. Whitney felt her jaw tighten and made herself not look at Nolan. She walked a slow circuit around the vehicle, touching nothing, studying the details that had caught her eye in the video. They were all there, every one of them. She reached into the interior breast pocket of her blazer and produced the check which she had written that morning in a hotel room in Phoenix. She set it on the hood. $1 million, made out to Garrett Holloway. I think a man running a garage like this one doesn't need to pretend he needs time to think, she said, and there was something underneath the words that was designed to land a specific way, and it did land, but not the way she intended. Garrett looked at the check. He looked at the car. Something in his expression was entirely still the way a level surface holds still in wind. Not even for 1 million, he said. Whitney blinked. She waited for a revision or a qualifier. None came. She looked at Nolan, who looked back at her with the expression of a man who is trying not to look as surprised as he is. Then she laughed. A short, genuine laugh that carried something in it she hadn't entirely meant to let out. He just turned down the opportunity to change his life over a pile of old sheet metal, Nolan said quietly to the other staff members. Garrett did not acknowledge this. He reached over, lifted the check from the hood by one corner, and offered it back to Whitney without drama. You're paying for the car, he said. But I'm waiting for someone who understands its history. Whitney took the check. She stood there for one extra beat, the kind that happens when a prepared person encounters an unprepared situation, and then walked back toward the Rolls-Royce. Before she got in, she turned back once. No one else is going to come out here and offer you more than this, she said. It was meant as a warning. It came out sounding slightly less certain than intended. Word travels in small towns in a way that has nothing to do with technology, and everything to do with the fact that people don't have much else to do. By Wednesday evening, everyone in Denton who had any reason to know Garrett Holloway knew that he had turned down $1 million check from a Los Angeles businesswoman over an old muscle car sitting under a tarp in his garage. The responses ranged from disbelief to amusement, to a specific kind of pity that people reserve for someone they assume has made a catastrophic mistake. The man who ran the auto parts counter 2 blocks away suggested, not unkindly, that Garrett might want to consider that the woman had looked like she knew what she was talking about. The supply vendor, who had extended him credit on 2 consecutive orders, called the next day to let him know the account was being frozen pending payment. A property management office sent a certified letter about the outstanding tax balance and included a polite but specific timeline. Tessa came home from school on Thursday with the particular quietness that means a teenager has heard something and is deciding whether to bring it up. She made dinner. She did her homework. She waited until Garrett was sitting at the kitchen table with cold coffee before she said, "Someone's dad at school said you could have paid off the house and put money away, and you said no." Garrett wrapped his hands around the mug without lifting it. He didn't immediately explain himself, which was a quality Tessa had learned to read not as evasion but as thought. "Maybe," he said. "But what I was actually doing was not selling something I didn't fully understand yet." This was not satisfying to a 14-year-old who was old enough to grasp the number 1 million. "And if it turns out it isn't what you think?" she asked. He looked at her directly. "Then I still kept a promise to your grandfather. I wasn't going to hand that car to someone who was treating it like something to be cleared out of the way." What Garrett had not told anyone in Denton, not Tessa, not Dale Pruitt, not the parts counter man, was that several weeks before Whitney Boone arrived, he had scanned the contents of his father's metal lockbox and sent the files to a man named Vaughn Mercer, a collector and independent automotive historian based in Sacramento who had spent 30 years documenting rare American production vehicles. Vaughn had seen the images and the documents and had gone very quiet for a long time before responding. He said he needed to see the car in person, but that the materials suggested something that could not be easily dismissed. He had been waiting for Garrett to confirm the car was still intact and undisturbed. The designation on the shipping invoice, GT500X Holloway unit, was not a notation Vaughn had seen on anything outside of archived correspondence from a 1967 performance development program. He wanted to be careful. He asked Garrett not to discuss the materials with anyone until they had spoken further. Garrett had agreed. He had said nothing to Whitney, not because he was playing a game, but because the process was not finished, and he had learned from his father that an incomplete answer is more dangerous than silence. When Vaughn called that Thursday night, his voice had an edge of urgency that Garrett hadn't heard before. "I need you to bring the car to me," he said. "I've found a corroborating archive. I need to look at the vehicle directly. Don't do anything public until I've confirmed what I think this is." Garrett set the phone down after the call ended and sat alone in the garage for a while. Outside, the desert had gone dark and the temperature had dropped the way it does in Arizona when summer loosens its grip for a few hours. He pulled the tarp back and looked at the car. He thought about his father. He thought about the way Roy Holloway had never sought attention for anything, had never claimed something was valuable without proof, had never let the judgment of people with more money than patience determine what anything in his life was actually worth. Getting a 1967 Shelby from Central Arizona to Sacramento in 10 days was not a straightforward task, and the complications began almost immediately. The car had not been driven long distances in years. Garrett was not about to run it 400 miles on mountain roads without a proper inspection first. He spent the first 2 days working through the car methodically, checking the brake lines, flushing the cooling system, cleaning the carburetor jets, replacing the fuel filter with an original specification part he had to source from a specialty supplier in Tucson. He did this at night after the garage closed, working under the overhead fluorescence with the radio turned low. Tessa appeared once or twice in the doorway to the living quarters above the garage, watched him work without comment, and went back to bed. On the third day, Garrett borrowed a covered car trailer from a friend named Clayton Reeves, who had a proper 4-post gooseneck and asked no questions other than when Garrett needed it back. On the fourth morning, before Garrett had loaded the car, a black SUV pulled into the lot and Nolan Pierce stepped out. He was alone this time, dressed casually in the way that people with expensive casual wardrobes do, and he carried himself with a slightly different quality than he had on his first visit, less the assistant and more the negotiator. He told Garrett he was authorized to offer $1.2 million. Payment within 24 hours, no inspection period, no delay. Garrett listened to the whole thing before responding. "Why the rush?" he asked. Nolan said the offer was time-sensitive. Garrett said the answer was the same. Nolan's jaw shifted slightly. "You're making a significant mistake," he said. Garrett picked up the torque wrench he had set down when the car arrived and turned back toward the trailer. "Maybe," he said, "but it's mine to make." Nolan stood in the lot for a moment, then got back in the SUV and drove away. Within the hour, he had called Whitney with the update. Whitney had spent much of the morning with a growing suspicion she had been suppressing since Tuesday, that Garrett Holloway's refusal hadn't been obstinacy. It had been knowledge. Whitney Boone was not accustomed to situations she couldn't redirect. She had spent 20 years in a business built entirely on finding things before other people understood their value, and now she was in the uncomfortable position of watching a man she had dismissed move deliberately toward an outcome she had assumed she could prevent. She contacted 3 automotive journalists and 2 collector network insiders, feeding them a version of the story that framed Garrett's claims about the car as a desperate exaggeration from a financially struggling owner. Within 48 hours, a brief item appeared on a collector blog. Garage owner claims ordinary Shelby is lost prototype. It was skeptical in tone, dismissive in conclusion. Garrett read it on his phone while parked at a truck stop outside Bakersfield. He did not respond, did not call anyone, and finished his coffee before pulling back onto the road. She called him directly that evening. The call lasted 6 minutes. She offered $1.5 million. He declined. She offered $2 million, contingent on a signed agreement and confidentiality. He declined. Her voice, over the phone, lost a specific quality of polish that it had maintained through every previous interaction. "You are playing the role of the righteous poor man," she said. "But righteousness doesn't pay for your daughter's education." It was a calculated thing to say, and she knew it was calculated and said it anyway because she was running out of other instruments. Garrett's response came without pause. "No," he said, "but it lets me sleep." The line went quiet for several seconds. "You're making a mistake you won't be able to undo," she said. He thanked her for calling and ended the conversation. He arrived at Von Mercer's facility on the outskirts of Sacramento the following afternoon. A low industrial building set back from the road, unmarked from the street, with the internal appearance of a museum that hadn't opened yet. Von was 61, a compact and precise man who moved through physical space with the same care he applied to language, which was to say deliberately and without waste. He met Garrett at the gate and looked at the trailer for a long moment before saying anything. "Let's get it inside," he said. The two of them unloaded the car together without ceremony and rolled it into the main examination bay, where the lighting was the cold, even white of a room designed to reveal things rather than flatter them. Von closed the bay doors. The work began. Von Mercer had not made a definitive authentication claim in 11 years, not since a disputed '48 Ford Coupe had produced a lawsuit that, while resolved in his favor, had cost him 9 months and a great deal of sleep. He was not going to rush this. He started at the front of the car and worked backward, his movements slow and methodical, using a handheld magnifier on the chassis stamp and a spectrometer attachment on the areas of bare metal around the door jambs. Garrett stood back and watched without speaking, which Von appreciated. Some owners hovered and narrated. Garrett simply held his father's lockbox and waited. The chassis number did not appear in the standard GT500 production registry, which was either an anomaly of record-keeping or something more significant. The front subframe carried a series of hand-welded reinforcements that were not found on street production models, but had been documented on 3 vehicles from a 1967 performance development program that Ford had commissioned and then discontinued following the death of a test engineer. The intake manifold bore a small stamp mark that matched no catalog designation from the period, but which appeared in a photograph from a 1967 internal Ford engineering memo that Vaughn had acquired from an estate sale 7 years ago and never been able to place. He said nothing about any of this yet. He kept working. When he reached the underside of the dashboard and found a small aluminum plate bolted to the firewall, the kind of identification tag used for internal tracking on prototype builds, he went still for a long enough time that Garrett noticed. Vaughn produced the engineering memo from a folder and held it next to the plate. The designation matched. He set the memo down, turned to Garrett, and held out his hand. "The lockbox," he said. Garrett gave it to him. Vaughn went through the contents the way a surgeon handles instruments. Each piece lifted, examined, set down without comment. The handwritten letter had a signature at the bottom that corresponded to a senior development engineer named Harold Kress, who had worked in Ford's Advanced Performance Division during the relevant period, and whose correspondence was part of a small archival collection held by a university library in Michigan. The photograph of Roy Holloway, standing beside the car, showed, in the background, a workbench with equipment that Vaughn recognized from another archived photograph of the Dearborn testing facility during the same program. He looked at the image for a full minute. Then he asked Garrett to start the car. The engine turned over with the particular voice that had caught Whitney Boone's attention through a 40-second clip filmed by a teenager on a phone, and it filled the bay with something that could not be faked by age alone. A colleague of Vaughn's who had arrived quietly sometime in the previous hour and positioned herself near the rear of the car looked up when the engine reached idle. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "The cam profile." Vaughn nodded. He turned off the engine himself, with a kind of deliberate respect. He stood up straight, set his hands flat on the top of the car, and looked at Garrett. "You didn't turn down $1 million because you were being stubborn," he said. "You turned it down because that number was never close to what this actually is." The news moved through collector networks with the particular speed of things that have been anticipated for a long time by the few people who know enough to anticipate them. Vaughn had not made any public announcement. He was far too careful for that. But in a community where a handful of specialists talk to one another, and where the rumor of a confirmed GT500X prototype was the kind of thing people had been whispering about for decades, it was inevitable that the right ears would hear before the wrong ones could act. Preston Tate heard on a Thursday morning from a specialist in Pebble Beach who had received a call from someone who had spoken to someone in Vaughn's circle. Preston called Vaughn directly. Vaughn confirmed only that he was conducting a formal authentication review and that any information would be shared through the appropriate channels in due course. Preston had first come to Whitney Boone 2 years earlier with a very specific request. Find him a vehicle with a real story, not a cosmetically restored showpiece, but something with documented provenance and genuine historical weight. He was a man who collected not for display, but for possession of narrative. The idea that an object could carry inside it the full weight of its own history, untouched and uncompromised. Whitney had taken the commission confidently. She had found several candidates, none of which satisfied him. She had been increasingly certain that the Shelby in Garrett's garage was the answer to that commission. The authentication confirmation, before it was even public, confirmed that certainty. Whitney learned that Preston had reached out to Vaughn through a contact in her own network, who had no idea they were delivering bad news. She sat with this information for a long time in her office in West Hollywood, the light coming through the glass from the courtyard, the 3 showcase vehicles sitting outside like evidence of a business she had built on exactly the kind of judgment she had failed to exercise in a parking lot in Arizona. She called her assistant and booked a flight to Sacramento. she arrived at Vaughn's facility the next morning, composed in the way that a person is composed when they are managing a significant amount of internal distress, and she asked to see Garrett. He came out from the examination bay where he had been working alongside Vaughn on the documentation for the formal review. He looked like a man who had been sleeping better than he had in weeks. Whitney stood straight and offered $3 million. Garrett looked at her for a moment. "Are you buying the car?" he asked, "or buying the right to say you were correct?" She didn't answer. He said, "The process is almost complete. The answer is still no." She told him that if the car went to auction without her involvement, she would raise questions about the sufficiency of the documentation with the auction house. He nodded, as if this were information he had already made arrangements for. "Talk to Vaughn," he said, and went back inside. The formal authentication session took place 5 days later, in the main examination room of Vaughn Mercer's facility, in the presence of a panel that included a Shelby documentation specialist from Texas, 2 representatives from a California auction house with a history of handling estate collections, an automotive historian on retainer for a museum in Detroit, and a legal notary named Marin Hale, who was there to certify the documentation chain. They worked through the evidence over 6 hours. The chassis number was cross-referenced against the 3 known surviving records from the GT500X program, 2 of which showed gaps where prototype units had been issued serial designations but not tracked through disposal. The engine stamping matched a batch assignment from the development program. The firewall plate matched the internal tag system used for prototype vehicles in the period. The photograph of Roy Holloway was confirmed by comparison with 2 other photographs from the same facility taken the same year, which appeared in archived collections at 2 separate institutions. And then there was the document that Vaughn had located independently, through a contact at a Michigan archive, during the 10 days since Garrett had first arrived. A typed transfer document, on Ford Motor Company letterhead, dated November of 1967, transferring Development Unit GT500X No. 2 from the Advanced Performance Facility in Dearborn to a private performance testing contractor listed by name as Holloway Performance Services, located in Tucson, Arizona. The vehicle was described as having been declared surplus to the development program following the termination of the project. The document had been filed, misfiled, and found in a miscellaneous box of budget records where it had sat undisturbed for more than 50 years. Roy Holloway had not been hiding anything. He had simply been keeping what was legally and legitimately his in the way that quiet men sometimes do, without announcement and without drama, waiting for a time or a person who would understand what it meant. Garrett sat in a chair against the wall of the examination room and held the transfer document in both hands. His hands were not entirely steady, but this was the kind of steadiness that has nothing to do with composure and everything to do with weight. The Shelby documentation specialist announced his conclusion formally for the record. The vehicle was authenticated as GT500X Development Unit No. 2, one of 3 prototypes produced under the program, the only one known to have survived intact and in operational condition. The auction house representatives exchanged a look with one another. The historian from Detroit sat very still. Vaughn said quietly that his preliminary estimate for auction value was between $3.8 and $4.5 million, and that this estimate did not yet account for the narrative premium that accompanied the vehicle's provenance story. Garrett set the document down on his knee and looked at the ceiling of the room for a while without speaking. He was not thinking about the money, or not primarily. He was thinking about his father, about Roy Holloway standing next to this car in a testing facility in 1967, keeping this specific object safe and whole and uncompromised for 40 years. Not because he thought it would be worth a fortune, but because he understood that some things do not reveal their nature on a schedule convenient to the people waiting for answers. The auction house set the date for 10 days from the moment Whitney Boone had first placed a check on that hood in a garage in Denton, Arizona. The auction was held in the private event space of a collector gallery in Pasadena, a long room with dark walls and precise lighting designed to make everything inside it look like it was already part of a museum. The 1967 Shelby GT500X was positioned at the center of the room on a low platform, the original paint under the exhibition lighting, showing every honest mark of a vehicle that had been used and preserved and not cosmetically corrected. Garrett stood near the back wall in a navy suit that he had bought the previous winter for a school event of Tessa's and had not worn since. Tessa was in the third row from the back, next to Vaughn's assistant, her hands folded in her lap with a stillness that she had inherited directly from her father. Whitney Boone was present, seated on the right side of the room midway back, and she had chosen her seat carefully, visible but not prominent, close enough to participate if she chose, positioned to observe. Preston Tate sat in the front row in a gray linen jacket and the particular ease of a man who has decided on his ceiling in advance and is not anxious about what happens below it. The auctioneer introduced the vehicle by reading from the authentication summary in a voice calibrated to convey significance without haste. 1967 Shelby GT500X. Development prototype. Unit number 2 of 3. One of 2 surviving examples from the program. The only survivor in operational condition. Documented chain of custody spanning more than 50 years. Held continuously by the Holloway family. Authentication confirmed by independent panel. Opening bid $1.5 million. Whitney's expression when she heard the opening number was the expression of a person doing arithmetic in front of an audience and finding the results unwelcome. The number she had offered, $1 million, presented as an act of generosity, had been eclipsed by the starting position before a single bid was recorded. The early bidding was careful and deliberate, the way it is when the people in the room have enough resources that the caution is professional rather than anxious. 1.5 became 2 million. 2 million became 2.8. At 3.5, a bidder by phone joined, and the room's temperature changed. Whitney made a single bid at 3.7, an act that Garrett understood immediately was not about acquiring the car. It was about being present in the record. Preston countered immediately at 4 million. The phone bidder came in at 4.3. Whitney did not bid again. Preston brought it to 4.8. The phone bidder paused, then came back at 5 million. Preston sat back. The room went quiet. The auctioneer repeated the number once, twice, 3 times. The hammer came down. The room exhaled and then, a half-second later, filled with the kind of applause that is less about celebration and more about recognition of something that was simply and completely correct. Garrett did not raise his hands. He did not make a sound. He stood against the back wall of the room with his arms at his sides and his chin slightly lowered, and if you had been close enough to watch his face, you would have seen something that was not triumph, and not relief, and not even satisfaction in the conventional sense of the word, but something quieter and more final, the feeling of a man who has delivered something to its rightful conclusion after a very long time. Preston Tate turned from the front row and found Whitney in her seat. He said, clearly enough that several people nearby could hear, "You watched a poor man refuse $1 million. What I watched was a man who knew precisely what he was holding." The coverage in collector circles was brief but emphatic, the kind of story that gets passed around among people who spend their lives thinking about the relationship between value and recognition. The facts were presented without embellishment because they didn't require it. Whitney Boone had visited Denton, had offered $1 million for a vehicle subsequently authenticated at $5 million, had been refused, and had laughed at the man who refused her. Boone Heritage Motors did not release a statement. Several collectors who had been considering consignments with the company quietly paused those conversations pending clarification. Preston Tate formally terminated his acquisition agreement with Boone Heritage, citing a preference to work directly with independent specialists going forward. The board of directors at Boone Heritage requested a meeting with Whitney within 2 weeks of the auction to discuss the company's valuation methodology and due diligence process. The blog post suggesting Garrett had exaggerated the car's significance was quietly amended without explanation. Whitney sought Garrett out after the auction at the rear of the gallery, in the low-light corridor where the catering had been set up, and most of the attendees had not yet drifted. She was not accompanied by Nolan. She had her coat over her arm, and she looked like a woman who had been thinking through what she intended to say and had discarded each version in sequence. She said, "I believed you didn't understand the value of what you had." Garrett was straightforward. "I know," he said, "but that wasn't actually what you believed. What you believed was that I didn't understand the value of myself." She looked at him for a long time without speaking. He did not press the moment further. He wasn't interested in her apology, and she seemed to understand this, which was perhaps the first moment of genuine understanding she had brought to any interaction involving Garrett Holloway. He turned and walked back into the gallery room, where Tessa was waiting near the door with Vaughn's assistant and the quiet, contained expression of a 14-year-old who is very proud of her father and has decided not to say so directly because she knows he already knows. Whitney stayed in the corridor alone for a moment. Through the gallery's rear window, she could see the transport vehicle waiting in the service lane. A fully enclosed climate-controlled trailer, the kind reserved for vehicles that have been formally elevated to the status of irreplaceable. 2 handlers in white gloves were preparing the ramp. She watched the Shelby roll toward the trailer door, moving forward on its own authority, into whatever was coming next. She had understood at some point during the auction that the most valuable thing about that car had never been its rarity or its authentication record or even its operational condition. It had been the fact that a man who could have used the money had chosen instead to wait until the world caught up to what he already knew. That kind of patience was not a quality she had experienced purchasing. It was, she was beginning to understand, not for sale at any price. The settlement from the auction, after the house's commission and various fees, came to $4.7 million. Garrett put $11,000 in taxes on the property. He cleared the outstanding balance with the parts supplier. He set aside a college fund for Tessa structured to cover 4 years at any school she chose, with a remainder for whatever she decided to do next. He hired a structural engineer to assess the garage, replaced the rolling door that had announced itself loudly for the better part of a decade, and invested in the lighting and climate control systems that made the back bay, formerly the home of the Shelby, into a proper restoration workspace. He put a sign above the workbench, not vinyl but painted wood, in the same font as the original Holloway Auto Works lettering on the outside, that read, "Know what you have before the world tells you what it's worth." Vaughn Mercer called 3 weeks after the auction to ask whether Garrett would consider joining him on a limited consultancy basis, reviewing provenance documentation for vehicles brought to his facility. He clarified that this was not a full-time arrangement and not something that would require Garrett to relocate or change the nature of his work in Denton. He simply trusted Garrett's eye and, more than that, his patience. Garrett agreed, with the condition that he take on no more than 4 or 5 cases per year. He had a garage to run and a daughter to raise and a life that was not in need of more complication, only more of itself. He did not use the money to buy anything that announced its own value loudly. He did not acquire things as replacements for things. The Shelby had been the only object of that kind in his life, and it had served its purpose fully and properly, and now it was someone else's. Tessa asked him, on a Sunday morning 3 weeks after the auction, whether he missed it. They were at the kitchen table, same as always. The coffee going, and the light coming in low from the east window, and the sound of a slow morning in a town that had not fundamentally changed. Garrett thought about the question in the way he thought about most things, without hurry. "I didn't sell a memory," he said finally. "I sold the car after the whole world finally understood the memory was worth something. That's different." Tessa considered this, nodded once, and went back to her breakfast. This was the shape of their mornings. The new rolling door on the garage opened quietly on a Monday in late October, and a man drove in with a 1970 Mustang Mach-1 that needed a valve job and had a story he wanted to tell someone who would listen. Garrett listened. He wiped his hands on a red shop rag that had faded from long use and was still perfectly functional, and he pulled the car into the bay and got to work. On the wall above the door, in the light that now fell cleanly and without the flicker of failing fluorescence, the painted sign said what it said and meant what it meant. 10 days before, Whitney Boone had believed she was looking at a man too poor and too proud to accept a rescue. What Garrett Holloway had been doing, all along, was simply this: waiting for the world to understand what he had already known.
I didn't know I could use that move. Oh shit. Oh shoot. Oh. Shit. I think we get in this time. Oh wow. Oh shit, I should have hit him first. It was a good hit, but fuck. Heal up. Oh. Oh my gosh. No. Oh. Almost got him. Almost got him.